What's up, guys, and welcome back to another ranking video. This video has took quite a while for me to make because I've had a bunch of problems with making it due to, oh, I forgot to click record, or, oh, this video software doesn't go for more than 20 minutes. So, yeah, I'm going to finally do this ranking video. Some of these projects I won't count because it might be, like, behind-the-scenes stuff. So I'm just going to leave them down here when we do the ranking. So first up, we got Ant-Man and the Wasp. Now, this is a pretty mediocre movie. I don't have much to say about it. It's not the best MCU movie. It's not the worst, but I wouldn't say it's meh or bad. So I'm going to put it in the B tier. Next up is Iron Man. Now, I think that this is a perfect origin movie for the character of Iron Man. It's just a simple story about a man's redemption, and I like how it doesn't have the rest of the MCU on its shoulders. And I don't really have much wrong with it. Like, they could have hinted more at how Tony Stark and Obadiah Stane are a bit similar, but that's the only thing I would have changed about this movie, and it's pretty much a perfect MCU movie. Next up is Ant-Man. This one is kind of like the first. It's kind of like the second one, but it's better. The only reason this one would stay out of A tier is I feel like it's a bit too much like the first Iron Man movie, but I do like how it's a heist movie and it's very small scaled. Next up is Avengers Age of Ultron. Now, this is very big scaled, not small scaled at all. This movie is basically the first Avengers just with more of it, which I guess it's its problem because it's basically if they just kept all the great things about the first movie and did not try to add like double it, triple it. I feel like it could have been a pretty good movie. And also they could have made Ultron kind of like how they did in the trailer with more like a horror movie villain. Next up is Avengers Infinity War. This is probably my favorite Marvel movie. This is, in my opinion, I have no problems with it. The humor lands, the story's great, awesome villain, awesome characters, good motives. S tier. Next up is Captain Marvel. Now, this might be my most controversial take. Well, it's the only one I've really been like, this should be higher, or it's way better than this. But I don't really like Captain Marvel. So I'm going to put it in D because I'm just not a big fan of it. I don't think it's downright terrible, but I do like getting to see a younger Nick Fury. Next up is Winter Soldier. This is a very overrated movie. I find the start to be extremely slow, but it eventually does get to be pretty good. I do agree that it is a very good movie, but I don't think it's great or best tier at all. Next up is First Avenger. There's nothing really crazy about this movie, but I do like it quite a bit. But I do find the origin stuff to be way better than basically the first act of the movie is better than the other two acts, which is my only big problem with it. Next up is Civil War. I feel like this is a very great MCU movie. Um, this movie did the Tony Stark Team Iron Man versus Team Captain America perfectly. And they gave them such good, compelling motives that people are still arguing about which side was better today. Comment down below which side do you think was right. I think it's personally Captain America, but that's just my opinion. Next up is Doctor Strange. Now, in my opinion, this is probably one of my favorite comic book origin stories. I feel like it could have been in the great tier if only they had made the villain a bit more interesting and they allowed the movie not to follow the MCU formula. This is the movie when it starts to kind of get repetitive and it's kind of predictable. Next up is Avengers Endgame. Now, this is another best tier movie. In my opinion, this was the perfect end to the Infinity Saga. My only real complaint with it is I feel like they could have handled a bit of the Thor stuff better, and I hated what they did with Hulk. But overall, it's an S tier movie, in my opinion. Next up is Guardians. Speaking of S tier movies, I love this. Not C tier. I love this movie. It's pretty much James Gunn at his best, making a good story about very broken heroes, and they make you fall in love with these characters, even though they're stupid things like a talking tree that can only say 3 words. And they just make you love these characters and want to see more of them. And it's pretty much a perfect origin for the whole team. So I'm going to put it in S tier. Next up is Guardians 2. Now, I really enjoy this movie too. I feel like they handled Yondu's death the best out of that was probably the best part about the movie was the Yondu stuff, and I feel like that handled very good. My only big problem with this movie is it has a little bit too much jokes, and not all of them land. But it's not to the point where it's like Thor: Love and Thunder. But I do really like this movie. Next up is Spider-Man: Far From Home. It's a pretty generic MCU movie. It's not really a good Spider-Man movie, but it's a good MCU movie. There's not much I really have to say about it. It just feels like another generic MCU movie. But I do really like Mysterio and the Peter Parker high school elements. I just find the superhero stuff to be way less interesting. Next up is The Incredible Hulk. Now, this movie is very flawed, but I do like to see Edward Norton as the Hulk, and I like a more savage and serious approach on the character. So that's what holds it back from being in the D tier. Also, it has some pretty cool action sequences. Next up is Iron Man 2. Pretty mediocre, too many plot lines, messy story. There's not much I really need to say. Iron Man 3, this movie is pretty divisive for me because it usually depends on my opinion when I watch it. Sometimes I think sometimes I think it's like around middle of B tier. Sometimes I think it's terrible. One of my recent rewatch, I liked it quite a bit. My only real problem with it is I feel like they very much weakened up too much the Iron Man drones, and they should have just kept the villain to be a grounded like more a grounded take on the Mandarin, which I really liked. And I actually liked him. They just kept him like that better than what they did in Shang-Chi with him. Next up is Black Panther. Now, I love this movie a lot, but what holds it back from being higher up is it does have some pretty messy choreography and CGI when you get to that back half of the movie. But overall, it's a very good MCU movie, just not very enjoyable. Next up is Spider-Man Homecoming. Now, in my opinion, this was a perfect like standalone story for Tom Holland Spider-Man. They could have kept out Iron Man, yes. Would it have still been good? Probably not as much. But I do think it's a very good and great MCU movie. Vulture is a very good villain. And this movie mixed Spider-Man and MCU pretty good. Next up is the original Thor. There's not much I really have to say about it. It feels like two different movies into one. Yeah. Next up is Thor: The Dark World. Not much really I have to say about that one too. D tier. It's bad. The only good thing about it is Loki, really. Next up is Thor. Yes. Next up is Hulk. Next up is Thor Ragnarok. I keep putting in the wrong tier. This movie I feel like is great. It balances the humor with the seriousness very well. I have no real complaints about this movie. It I just really enjoy it, and I just love it. I feel like they could have done more with Hela though, because she just wants to take over the universe because reasons. There's not really much to her motives of the character, but I do like how it gives us a new outlook on Odin. Next up is the original Avengers. Now, this movie is a very fun MCU movie. It's just cheesy fun with the Avengers, and I feel like we need more MCU movies like this. And it's the first movie to really take on the team formula, and I feel like it does it pretty well. Next up is WandaVision. I feel like this is very underrated, but it is not as fun when you rewatch it. Like, this is terrible for rewatching. And I feel like the episode formula of this worked really well, and the week-to-week hype between the episodes was very fun. Next up is Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Now, this is a very divisive take, but I actually am going to put it in the great tier right above Guardians 2. I feel like the only reason that puts it higher is some of it is a bit corny. The villain is way too sympathetic, and Sharon Carter it's so obvious to guess that she was a bad guy the entire time. But overall, it has relatable story, good characters, good formula, and I feel like we need more MCU projects like this. Just take all the other stuff out. Also, I feel like John Walker was the big standout for me. Next up is Loki. It's kind of like WandaVision for me, but I find this one to be more enjoyable and more rewatchable. So I'm going to put it in A tier. But I do really like this. And I feel like it was a good introduction to the multiverse part of the MCU. Next up is Shang-Chi. I find this to be very overrated. The characters are alright. Shang-Chi is pretty cool, but there's not like much great about the movie. So I'm going to put it right above here because I do find a lot of it to be very cheesy, and there's way too much CGI in the movie. Next up is Black Widow. I pretty much agree with most people on this, but I do think it's underrated. I do think Taskmaster is a waste of a villain in the MCU, so I'm going to put it at top of C tier. Next up is What If. Now, this isn't really trying to have like a great story or anything, but I really like this. It's just some fun, like, ooh, what if this happened instead? Which I find to be that concept to be very interesting and fun, so I'm just going to put it there. Next up is Hawkeye. My only real complaint with this is that there isn't more episodes. It balances Christmas in the MCU to be pretty good, and it's just a fun time to watch it. Next up is Eternals. I find this one to be pretty underrated, but I do agree that it's not that good, so I'm going to put it right under Iron Man 3. Next up is Spider-Man No Way Home. Now, I really like this movie. It's not perfect, but this movie will always have a special place to me because it brings back all these characters. Even without the nostalgia stuff, it's still a great movie, and it's fun getting to see the villains in the 3 Spider-Man again. So next up, I got some of the other Spider-Man / Venom movies, which I'm going to count them, but not the Venom movies because, well, we never really got to see Tom Holland's Spider-Man and Tom Hardy's Venom get to interact, and I'm going to count these Spider-Man movies. Next up is Spider-Man 2. Now, this movie is very good. There's not much I have to say about it. It's pretty much a perfect comic book movie, but I feel like it's just not up to the hype level as the other two. Next up is Spider-Man 3, another underrated project. I actually like this one. I think it's a good-ish movie. It does have too many plot lines. Venom is kind of bad, but overall, I do like this. Next up is Amazing Spider-Man 2. I know people hate this. People like trash on it, but I love this movie, and yeah, there's nothing that will really get me to change that. That's just probably one of my more controversial takes out there, is that Amazing Spider-Man 2, in my opinion, is a great movie. Next up is Amazing Spider-Man. Now, I really like this movie. Lizard was a bit too cheesy, but that's only my real complaint, and I'd like getting to see a darker take on Spider-Man. Next up is the original Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, and this movie is really good. It's like a perfect superhero origin. It's probably my favorite superhero origin. I have no complaints about it, other than the CGI, and Green Goblin is a bit campy in it. Next up is Daredevil. This is my favorite Marvel project ever. It balances the characters with the superhero stuff with the villains all nicely. Season 1, perfect first season. Season 2 isn't perfect, but the first 4 episodes are amazing. The rest of it's pretty just mediocre, and season 3 is phenomenal. So it goes top of S tier for me. I'm so upset that they canceled it, but that's just me with it. Next up is Moon Knight. Now, I do really like this show. I feel like we should get more of it, but I do agree with some of the problems people have with it, and I feel like when they do another season, they should just take those parts out, but then I think it would be pretty well received. Next up is Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. This movie was probably the best we've seen of Scarlet Witch. And Doctor Strange is pretty good in this movie, and I really like the overall story and plot of this. So I'm going to put it in A tier. Next up is Miss Marvel. Now, this one, I found the first 2 episodes to be very good. It actually had me way more hyped than I thought it was going to be. But I found the rest of it to just be pretty mediocre. I don't really have any desire to rewatch any of it other than like the first 2 episodes. So it goes C tier for me. Next up is Thor: Love and Thunder, another very underrated Marvel project in my opinion. I do agree the dialogue is kind of a mess and the jokes are way too campy. But overall, I actually have some fun when I watch this movie. I'm going to skip over these and get all the way to She-Hulk. Now, I don't hate it as much as most people do, but I do agree that it is not a very good MCU thing because it just has a bit of a messy story and it uses the fourth wall to put in messy plot points. So I do not like that. Next up, we got Werewolf by Night. I actually find this one to be overrated. People hype this one up to be way over what it actually is, but it is a pretty good Marvel project, so I'm going to put it in B tier. Next up, we got Guardians Holiday Special. Just a fun time with the Guardians. Nothing really crazy about it. So I'm going to put it right here. Next up is Black Panther Wakanda Forever. This movie, I actually loved it. I don't really agree with the other people on the problems they have with it. I actually didn't find it that long at all. I find it to go by very quickly, and when we got to the final battle, I was pretty surprised that we were already on the final battle. Well, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe for other ranking videos. This one took me a lot of different takes to make, and this one, I basically spent a month on it. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in more ranking videos coming later this week.